Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to study the book of Ezra, chapter 10, thus completing this very interesting and unfortunately often overlooked book of Ezra. If you recall, in chapter 9, we read about how Ezra was informed that many of the people who had settled, many of the Judeans and the Jewish people who had settled in the land of Judah before Ezra's arrival had begun to intermarry and take wives from the local population, many of whom were still worshiping idols and practicing the practices of the local population, worshiping the local gods and so on. And because Ezra was so concerned about how this would corrupt the people and bring their hearts away from God and bring their hearts back to idol worship, and it seemed like they were following unfortunately the same patterns that their forefathers during the time of the first temple had followed. Ezra was very concerned. Ezra prayed to God. Ezra lamented the fact, and we read Ezra's prayers to God in chapter 9. So chapter 10 begins with a very distraught Ezra, one who feels almost hopeless. This type of behavior had led to such destruction before, and now they're just going back to their same old ways. And the people around him were also influenced very much by Ezra's sadness. The people with him, as we read about in chapter 10, verse 1, Ukehispalel Ezra ukehisvadoso, and as Ezra was praying, and as he was confessing before God, Boche umisnapel, and he was crying and fallen, Lifnei Veis Elohim, in front of God's house, in front of the Holy Temple. Nikpitzu elav mi Yisrael, many of the Jewish people gathered near him and gathered around him. Kahal Rav Ma'od, a great congregation, group of people, Anoshim v'noshim v'ladim, men, women, and children. This is very interesting because the verse, and we'll see and understand why as we study, the entire community, the women and children and the men, families, remember that, take note of that because this is important, gathered around him, ki vachu ha'am harbe becha, because the nation was crying a lot of crying. I want to remind you that of the tradition which we had mentioned when we studied Malachi, and I mentioned it several times as we studied Ezra, and that is that the tradition of the rabbis is that Ezra and Malachi were one and the same. Malachi, the final prophet, and Ezra, the first rabbi, as we've used that term as we studied Ezra, were one and the same. And this episode here of all of the people gathered and crying, one, of course, will understand that people were crying over their sins, but it also emphasizes the marriages, the families, the children, and the potential for broken families was what made the people cry. In case isn't as clearly explicated here in Ezra, but if we go back to Malachi, and we recall, which was the same episode as Ezra himself, as Malachi, as the prophet said in Malachi chapter 2, the people, I want to read this to you so that you fully understand it. Chapter 2, verse 10, the people are crying, Halo avechad likulanu, the people are crying out to Malachi / Ezra. We all have the same father, all of us, in other words, us and our Gentile wives. Halo el echad bra'anu, we were all created by the same God. We're all human beings. Madua nivgad ish b'yachiv, why should one man rebel against the other? L'chalel bris avoseinu, in such a way that we would be disrupting the covenant that we made with our forefathers. In other words, the people are saying, we're all family, we're all together, we're all human beings. We love each other, we're all together on this. Why is this such a terrible thing on the one hand, and why is it that this is breaking the covenant with our forefathers? And when we studied Malachi, we then understood Ezra's answer to them was Bagda Yehuda Yisrael. The reason why this is bad, and the reason why this is such a terrible thing that's being done, something that's this abomination that's being done in Israel of Yerushalayim, Kichilel Yehuda Kodesh Adonai Asher Ahev, because Yehuda, the people of Judah, have defiled the holy God that it loves, Uval Bas El Nechar, and they are living with daughters of a foreign God. In other words, the issue is, of course, El Echad Bra'anu. Of course, we were all created by one God. Of course, Av Echad L'Kulanu. Of course, we're all human beings. Of course, God does not like this breaking up of families. The problem is, it's Bas El Nechar. The problem is that these women have maintained their attachments to those other gods, right? This is the problem that Ezra answered them. And once the people bring into their home a woman who is still worshiping other gods, then Yachreis Adonai Lo'ish, then God should, may He destroy this, cut this person off from God. May his offerings be not accepted before God, and so on. And Ezra, as Malachi, emphasized this there, where he stated, if you recall, Kisonei shalach amar Adonai Yisrael. God hates it when a man has to divorce his wife and one sends his wife out. In other words, God does not like this, and therefore in the verse before that, in verse 15, and same thing in that chapter of Malachi, it says, I want you to be careful with your spirits. I do not want you to rebel against the wife, the woman who you love, the woman who you married as a youth. So this is the issue, and also in verse 14, you're asking me why. You're asking me why is this bad? It is God who is testifying between you and between the woman who you married, because you have rebelled against her. And she is your beloved, she is the wife with whom you made a covenant of marriage. So in other words, the point here is that what does it mean that God has borne witness? The point that Ezra and Malachi, as the same person, is stating is that the problem here is that this love exists. Yes, this common humanity exists. But when one of them, the person has a completely different set of values, and is worshiping idols, and is practicing the abominable and corrupt practices of idol worship, this is the issue when you bring such a person into your home and you develop these relationships with someone who will bring you astray from God. So be careful, make sure that because everything is from the male perspective here, but of course it would go the other way around as well. If it's a woman, make sure that he has that, at least shares that basic value, so that the love can endure, a positive love, a love that brings fulfillment to this family. And now, so in other words, it is not an issue of racism, so to speak. It's not an issue of she happens to be a daughter of the other nation. That's not the problem. In fact, we saw in Ezra, if you recall, going back to chapter 6, verse 21 in Ezra, we saw that Ezra himself, when he described the celebrations of the people when they brought the first Passover sacrifice in the second temple, these very same people, looking at verse 21, it says over there, V'chol hanivdol, and look at that, be careful with that language, Vayochlu b'nei Yisrael hashovim me'hagula, the people of Israel who had returned from the exile, ate of the Paschal lamb, together with v'chol hanivdol mitumat goyei haaretz aleim lidrosh l'Adonai Yisrael, that all of those, and all of the commentaries understood this to be referring to, and if you look at the context, you'll understand why. All of those of the nations of the land who separated themselves from the defiled ways of the lands and then converted, lidrosh, and went to search out and to join the people of God, l'Adonai Yisrael, to join the people of God, the God of Israel. So in other words, many of the people of the land did convert to Judaism and were accepted and were part of those who came and worshipped at the temple. Now remember that language, v'chol hanivdol, because we're going to refer to that many times as we study chapter 10. So what happens? Ezra now is here. Ezra is crying. These families are crying. They're sad, and this is just an awful thing. They're thinking we're going to have to separate from our wives, from our children. Remember that dialogue that we just read in Malachi. The people are crying, but we're all members of one family. And then Ezra explained to them the problem. The problem is the value system. So there is hope. What's the hope? Look, verse 2. Vayan Shechaniah ben Yechiel. Shechaniah the son of Yechiel answered, Mibnei Elam. He was from the children of Elam, from that family of Elam. Vayomer leEzra. He said to Ezra, Anachnu ma'alnu ve'Eloheinu. It is us. We are the ones who rebelled against our God. Vanoshev. Now this is a very crucial word here. Vanoshev, and we have, from the word of shev, meaning to settle in, to reside with. And it's a word here that means powerful, to settle into the family, into our families. And this is going to, this word, the shin vet, as the shoresh, is going to repeat itself numerous times throughout this chapter. The emphasis is on the nashim nachrios, the foreign women who have settled into our families, me'amei aretz, from the nations of the land. And this language, vanoshev, is the opposite of the other word that I told you to look out for and to continue to look out for. That is the nivdalu. That is the separate themselves from. Back in where I quoted from chapter 6, we talked about the people from the Amei Haaretz that were nivdalu, that separated themselves away from those to'evot, those abominations, those idolatrous practices. And on the flip side, here we have women that were noshev. The people did the opposite. They settled these women into their families. V'ata, however, Shechaniah is now talking to Ezra. Ezra is distraught. Ezra has basically almost given up hope. So therefore, Shechaniah says, V'ata, and now, don't worry, Ezra. Yesh mikveh Yisrael alzos. There is hope for the people of Israel regarding this issue. There is hope. There is hope. It is fascinating that he chooses the language mikveh. Mikveh, which is also famously the mikveh, and some of the commentaries, the Ralbag among them, point this out, that there is a way to purify ourselves. Mikveh is a language of hope, which is clearly the primary meaning, but it's not coincidental that he chooses this. The people can be purified. We can purify ourselves of this sin. And this purification is also a process that people go through when they convert to Judaism, when they are nivdal, when they separate themselves from the idol worship and then join the people of Israel. V'ata, and now, nichros bris, let us make a covenant le'Eloheinu, with our God. This making a covenant again reminds us, Shechaniah is reminding us of the bris when the people of Israel made at Sinai. They made a covenant with God and had a process of mikveh, a process of conversion, a process of separating themselves from foreign gods and attaching themselves to God. And how will we do this? L'hotzi chol hanashim, we will get rid of, we will separate ourselves from all those women, v'hanolad mehen, and those children, ba'atzas Adonai, by the advice of God Himself, v'hacharedim, and those who are fearful b'mitzvahs Eloheinu. It's interesting, we use a term that has modern connotations and meaning, but here it's one of those few places in Tanakh where we find this word to mean those who are in fear of the commandments of God, that want to listen, v'chat Torah ye'aseh, and we will do as the Torah commands us. In other words, we can purify ourselves, we can re-enter a new covenant with God, and we will send away those women who have remained attached to their idols and the children that are with them, because as we shall see later, also the children always go with the mother. Now here is something fascinating that I would like to point out. I told you to pay attention to that word vanoshev, the language of noshev, and we're going to see it repeated several times. But I want to point out another place where we find this term used, and that is in the book of Ruth, the book of Ruth. If we look at the book of Ruth, chapter 2, we find this term repeated over and over again. Actually, verse chapter 1. We find this term over and over again, and where we have Ruth joining the Jewish people. And we have the word shuv, lashuv, over and over and over again. So let's start with verse 7 in chapter 1 in Ruth. Here we have Ruth is going with her mother-in-law. Ruth and Arpa are now going with the mother-in-law Naomi as Naomi is returning to the land of Israel. So she has her two daughters-in-law, and she says, Lech na shovna isha leveisima. The simple translation is, go and return, each woman return to your mother's house. Go back to those nations. Shovna meaning, but it also means go settle with them, rejoin them, right? But then they answer, again in verse 10, what do they respond? Vatomarno la, they respond, Ki itach nashuv li'amech. No, we are going to return. Now this here cannot mean return. Rus and Arpa have never been members of the Jewish people, but they say, no, nashuv li'amech, we want to go and join your nation. And then it goes back and forth, and Naomi then says, Shovna v'nosai lechna, I want you to go, return over there, go back to your people. Again, that language, Shovna, we see it repeated over and over again. Again in verse 15, go back to your El Amma, each one of you should go back to your nation, to your gods. Shuvi acharei yimtech, right? Again, the language, Shuvi. And again, in verse 16, it's over and over again, Lashuv me'achach. We see this language repeated over and over again. It's not for nothing that Ezra is choosing this language when he's talking about the people of the land that have now have now settled into the Jewish homes, but this time they have not separated themselves. As we see in chapter 10, when in chapter 2, when Boaz speaks to Ruth, he tells her something really important. He says to her in verse 11, Hugedu Gad li, it has been told to me everything that you have done, after your husband died, Ta'azvi avich v'imech v'eretz molatech. You have abandoned your family and your land. In other words, you've abandoned your customs, vatelchi el am asher lo yadatet moshem, and then you have come to join this new nation of yours. In other words, you have abandoned them, and you have been shoved, and you have settled in here. And again, he uses a land over there, where Ruth says, "V'anochi nachriya," right? I am a stranger. Boaz says, no, you are not a nachriya. You are not a stranger, because you have left. You have ta'azvi avich v'himech, and then come and joined this new nation. However, over here, what we have is people that have not abandoned their gods and then joined the Jewish people by marrying into the Jewish people. This is the problem here, and this is the issue here. So, in verse 4, Ezra says, Kum. Ezra is not speaking here. This is still Shechaniah speaking, when he's still giving Ezra encouragement, and he says, Kum, get up. Stop this crying. Stop with your face down. There's hope. There is a plan. There is something we can do. Exactly what his plan is. Obviously, he stated, we are going to separate ourselves from the women and children who remain nachriot, who remain strangers. But we can do this. Kum, I need you to get up, Ezra. Ki alecha hadavar. It is your responsibility. You're the leader here. V'anachnu imach. But we're with you. Chazak v'aseh. Get strong and do it. This is fascinating. Ezra is here, has already established himself as the leader, but he lost hope, and it took one of the leaders of the people who has really just welcomed Ezra. Remember, Ezra was a newcomer, and he needs to give Ezra strength and says, no, We can do this, Ezra. We need you to get up, act as a leader, stop the crying, stop the praying, and do. Chazak v'aseh, get up and do. This is classic Judaism. You can pray, you can cry, but the bottom line is chazak v'aseh. You need to get up and do. If you don't get up and do, all the prayer, all the crying is useless, means nothing. And then immediately, verse 5, Vayokam Ezra. Ezra gets up. Vayashpa et sorei ha-kohanim halavim. And he had all of the leaders of the Kohanim, of the priests, Halavim, and of the Levites, V'chol Yisrael, and the leaders of all of the Judeans, in other words, all the families, La'asos kadavar hazeh, that they are going to do this. They are going to get this done. Vayishaveu, and they all swore. So Vayokam Ezra milifnei Beis Elohim, Ezra got up from the temple. In other words, it's great to go to synagogue and get down and pray, but sometimes action is necessary. Get out of the synagogue, go to the streets, and do what needs to be done. So Vayelech el Ishkas Yochanan ben Eliashiv. He went to the room of Yochanan ben Eliashiv. Vayelech sham, and he went there. Lechem lo achal mayim lo shasa. He was still fasting. He had not eaten bread or drank water. Ki misabel al me'al ha'golah, because he was mourning over the rebelliousness of those that had returned from exile and resettled in the land. Vaya'aviru kol b'Yehuda. So Ezra said, okay, we got to get all the people together. Vaya'aviru kol b'Yehuda b'Yerushalayim. An announcement went out in all of Judah, all of Judea and Jerusalem, l'chol b'nei Agola, to all of the people that had returned from exile. L'ikavetu Yerushalayim. They all must gather in Jerusalem so we can set out the plan. V'chol asher lo yavo l'shloshes hayamim. And if you don't come within the next 3 days, katzas hasarim hazkenim, as the leadership, all of the officers and the elders had advised, Yocharam kol ruchusho, all of his property will be confiscated, v'hu yibadel, and he will be separated mikahal hagola. He will be separated from this community of returnees from exile. So that's the end of verse 8. There's a lot left for us to study in this chapter. I'm going to stop here, and we're going to finish the chapter in 10b next time. But and I'm going to continue pointing out a lot of these points so that we can fully understand what's really going on here in this last chapter of Ezra, which I think is a really, really important and a really deep lesson, and will really go to the heart of both intermarriage and conversion, both what it means to join the Jewish people and be a part of it, and what it means to not contaminate, so to speak, oneself by bringing in people into your family that share a completely different set of values. And we're going to also go to the heart of this issue of, isn't the opposition to intermarriage racism? And which is a question and an accusation many would ask. And some would point to this chapter of Ezra as sounding somewhat racist, asking them but remember what I pointed out from Malachi, that the issue is not a racial issue. The issue is those that have maintained their idolatrous ways. However, those that convert, those that are brought in, as we saw Ezra himself in chapter 6, when Ezra wrote this book, he wrote about those that separated themselves from their gods and converted to Judaism, Lidros Esh Hashem, were welcomed with open arms into the temple, and were welcomed to join in the feast of the Paschal sacrifice when the new temple was formed. We're going to continue this next time. Thank you so much for studying chapter 10a together. Looking forward to studying chapter 10b and completing this book of Ezra together.